Thanks very much for agreeing to take part in this interview. I'd like to start by asking you what you see as the essence of the sharing economy that makes it different from the traditional sort of economic relationships that we've sort of grown up with.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. That's a very challenging question, in part because people have very different definitions of what the sharing economy is. So I'll answer it with reference to the different parts of the sharing economy. Let me start with what I think we could all agree is truly sharing, and that is the sort of community-based, typically nonprofit initiatives that are popping up all over the world, in fact, that are oriented to people either sharing tools like makerspaces,
Right.
or sharing services like time banks, sharing expertise, repair collectives, and so forth. And virtually all of those have the ambition of creating economic relationships that are very distinct from canonical capitalist relationships. So they're either gift economies or barter economies, or the creation of common resources like in a makerspace and so forth. So those are trying to kind of really push people in the direction of different kinds of economic relationships. So they're pretty radical, and they also tend to be generally fairly small scale, although there are some that are platform-based, like an initiative such as couch surfing or free cycle, which are free. Couch surfing it's like Airbnb where you don't pay.
Right.
Or free cycle, which is a gifting platform for durable goods, consumer items, basically. So that whole group is kind of oriented to creating cooperative, often non-monetized, although not exclusively, relationships among people in which making profit is absent from.
So that's like the sort of relationship you might have with your neighbor, where you say, I'm out of sugar, etc., or can I borrow that tool, etc., but just making it to a wider community, if you like.
Right. And these kinds of sharing initiatives are either sort of place-based and local, in which case there's a lot of face-to-face interaction and people know each other well, or they tend to be more, or if they're online, it's sharing among people who are previously strangers and who may, couch surfing, obviously not, because there's a face-to-face, but something like free cycle, you may not really get to know these people much at all. So that concept of stranger sharing is really key to understanding the online quote unquote sharing economy, including the for-profit platforms, something like Airbnb, which is obviously that's a monetized platform. What's different about it is that the platform, through its digital technology and its crowdsourcing of information about the users of the platform,
right,
attempts to make stranger exchange far more viable than in the past by reducing the risks and also providing insurance and convenience and so forth. So Airbnb, which is, very contentious whether or not it's sharing. Many people argue if there's money involved, it's not sharing. Disagree with that. But the idea there is that people have durable assets which are not fully utilized, like a spare bedroom in your home, and that it is both economical and socially positive, and also they argue environmentally beneficial to make exchanges that allow strangers to come and use that.
Yeah.
Now, big questions about the social and environmental benefits of this, but not much question that it has been economically beneficial for the hosts and the guests.
I mean, it could be in strict economic terms, presumably, you could just say it reduces transaction costs.
It reduces transactions costs, but honestly, that's a kind of empty category, transactions
Okay.
costs. I like to be a little bit more specific about what it does and how it does it. But yes, a sort of conventional view would say these platforms, and this is absolutely correct, these platforms have dramatically reduced the transactions costs involved in stranger exchange. And so they make the trusted brand providers, the hotel, less useful. They reduce the value of trusted brands because you're now getting that kind of what you get from that trusted brand through a platform through different means.
Because other people are sort of marking them and rating them, how good they are, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And also the brand is providing insurance and so forth.
So if these are the sorts of emerging models, I mean, what difference do you see them making? I mean, in terms of, I mean, you've started talking about potential social connection. What about power, equality, sustainability? Where are they going, do you think? Or is that obviously hugely variable?
You have a very variable landscape at the moment. A lot of things were started which don't seem to be thriving. And this varies a lot across country. So for example, in the United States, I think we've seen less growth in these nonprofit community-based sharing initiatives than, for example, in Europe, where they're doing much better.
Okay.
And that, I think, has to do with the larger political and social context. In Europe, you have municipal governments who are really trying to enhance these initiatives. The EU has taken an interest in them. And you already had sort of political cultures that were more amenable. So in Spain, you have that whole anarchist cultures, which have led to a lot of this even before it was called sharing economy. There was just a survey done in Ghent by Michel Bouwens of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, where he found in that small Belgian city over 500 commons and sharing initiatives and so forth. So those are happening. Generally speaking, I would say good effects. There, the issue really is how good, how big, it's scaling, and who are they reaching, and are they able to reach beyond the obvious kinds of populations? And the people who start them tend to be middle-class, highly educated young people.
Right.
And can they move beyond that to incorporate low-income people, immigrants, socially excluded groups, and so forth? That's been a lot more difficult in many of these cases.
And in the US, I always had this picture that at least in the wider countryside in the US, there were quite cohesive communities. Is it that these haven't grown there because they're already sort of sharing, there's already informal networks and that they don't need them? Or is it sort of not fitting into that sort of culture?
Well, I think a lot of those networks have been breaking down in the face of economic distress. Also, some of these rural areas, youth are leaving, so they haven't maintained their vibrancy. The sharing economy is very much an urban phenomenon.
Right.
For the online dimensions of it, you need that density of population because these initiatives don't work without really dense user bases. If you want to do, say, a platform where people are going to loan out tools and other household items to each other rather than have to go and buy them, if you have sparse participation, the distances that people have to drive to get them are too large or travel, and that makes the exchanges undesirable. So you really need that density. So these have been very, very urban. Now, if you take the durable, you take the, what we really would think of as sharing assets, for profit or monetized version of the sector. So things like Airbnb or rental platforms for household items or car, peer-to-peer car rental, peer-to-peer bicycle rental. And by peer-to-peer, I mean person-to-person, rather than having a company provide the assets. So that's, real asset exchange, either with or without money, among individuals.
Yeah.
Those have quite a varied outcomes, I would say. The platforms that have focused on household items, durable goods, and so forth have mostly failed. Many of them have gone out of business. People don't seem to be that interested in going to the trouble of doing these, either renting or loaning, borrowing small household items. It just doesn't seem worth it for them. The peer-to-peer car rental also is very small, partly because there's not that much money in it, and the car rental options from the regular companies are cheap enough that people use that. So the only one of these that's really made a big impact is Airbnb, where it's a big capital asset that you have, which is, an urban hotel room, basically.
I was told, actually at an event yesterday, that blah blah car sharing is sort of growing, and actually they see a key part of their business model is actually gathering data on the people who are sharing their cars. So people indicate what sort of music they're likely to listen to when they're traveling, and so on, and also in that the people traveling the car give feedback on how well the driver drove, which the insurance companies are quite interested in. So,
Interesting. Yeah.
Actually, it's sort of becoming the core business for the CEO of that is actually the data gathering and sale of that data to interested parties, rather than in the facilitation of the actual share.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. And yes, you're right. BlaBlaCar is exception to what I said. So it is a true shared experience, and that's a long distance ride share for people who aren't familiar with what it is. It doesn't really operate much in the United States. I don't know if it exists, but it hasn't been, as far as I know, hasn't been particularly successful, but I think it is in Europe. And it doesn't surprise me what you say, in part because my understanding with BlaBlaCar is that the financial transaction dimension of it is relatively small. So It's not like Airbnb, where the driver is charging as much as he or she can get. It's a small contribution to expenses.
Yeah.
So yes, then the question is, where is the, because it's organized as a for-profit firm, where is the value being extracted? And of course, data is so key. So that makes sense. To answer your question about Airbnb, what I would say is Airbnb has had very positive impacts for the people who use it. So hosts like it because they can earn significant amounts of money, and guests like it because it's offering a low-cost lodging with some people prefer it to chain hotels, which have a sameness to them, so it has more variety and individuality. They like the locations because many of them are in residential neighborhoods and so forth. On the other hand, Airbnb has had a number of really negative impacts for people, the outsiders, people who are not involved in it. And of course, the kinds of things that have been most identified and a lot of controversy about are impacts on neighborhoods. So you have some whole neighborhoods turning into kind of Airbnb neighborhoods.
Wow.
In some cities, particularly big tourist destinations, Barcelona, for example, San Francisco, New York, you have the impact of Airbnb on housing costs, so rental properties in particular. So they're both pulling rental properties off the long-term rental market and raising the cost. So if you own a building, for example, and you rent it out to long-term tenants, and then you decide you want to convert it to Airbnb, in many places, the revenue you can earn with the Airbnb option is 3 to 4 times what you would get with long-term renters. And you can hire people to manage the building and do the cleaning and so forth. So it's a very lucrative option. That's a big issue in the urban areas. Now, one thing that's starting to happen is regulation that's preventing that kind of Airbnb activity, taking commercial operators off the platform. So for example, in San Francisco, there's now a law that you can only rent out one property, and you can only do that for 180 days per year. You can rent continuously if you are in the property, but a growing number of Airbnb rentals have been entire homes or apartments. So the host is absent, buying up units just for the purpose of renting. So that idea of basically what we're doing is sharing an underutilized space goes out the window in that context. But these regulations are pushing the platform back to that earlier identity as, really sharing bedrooms within a unit.
And who is actually managing to regulate Airbnb in this way? I mean, because presumably, I always thought that these sort of online platforms are incredibly difficult to regulate, and presumably Airbnb won't want to restrict its market.
Well, so all of these regulations are municipal level. So that's the location at which the regulation is taking place. And you see that the regulations are starting in in the cities that have a lot more Airbnb activity. So San Francisco put in this very strict regulation. New York has done a lot. Boston is considering. LA is an interesting case. This kind of activity has always been illegal in LA. So there was never a time when it was legal. The city government allowed Airbnb to expand dramatically and didn't enforce the laws. But now they're in the process of putting in a law which makes certain kind of, let's just call it home sharing, legal, but makes the commercial operators illegal. They have to then become more like a regular hotel or something.
And Airbnb is cooperating with the municipalities on this.
They are now. Originally, they were faux cooperating, I would say. They would kick the commercial operators off, but then they'd let them come back on. So now they are. So for example, in San Francisco, the number of licensed, or the number of operators, hosts, fell by half when the new law came in. Hosts now have to get licenses and be registered and so forth. And it seems like Airbnb has had a shift. And then in Europe, I'm not sure what's come in yet, but you have cities. I was in Spain in December, and there were a lot of hearings going on about what these new regulations would be. But, the major cities are putting in regulations. Barcelona is a place which has had a tremendous amount of controversy about this because Airbnb grew so much as it became a very hot tourist destination over the last, 10 years or something. A lot of local opposition to Airbnb.
So is there just to try and sort of summarize, as far as I can see from what you're saying, really, if you take the sharing economy, then Airbnb is just huge and everything else is sort of fairly marginal. And of course, by expanding it, suddenly begin to hit other people. You've talked about the neighborhood effects and the housing market. Presumably it's not good for the hotel operators either to have this competitor. Is there anything else really than Airbnb that actually says the sharing economy is significant?
Yeah, I think that's right. Things like there was a bicycle sharing, an Airbnb for bicycles, that folded. All of the durable goods platforms pretty much have folded. So I would say that's basically right. And then there are a few other home sharing platforms that are HomeAway is an alternative to Airbnb. Of course, couch surfing is still around, but it's quite small relative to Airbnb. The hotel question is interesting because it turns out that the hotels, there's been some impact on hotels, but the market is somewhat bifurcated into business and leisure travel. Airbnb has only about 10% of its business is in business travelers. So they're still predominantly in commercial hotels, and the competition is much more for the low-end motels and sort of traditional beds and breakfasts, some of whom are now on Airbnb as well.
They are, yes.
That's
indeed.
a whole other,
Yeah.
Effect this has had. I mean, one other thing that's worth talking about, I'm quite interested in this, although we haven't managed to figure out how to study it yet, but that's the environmental impact of Airbnb. Because the company has claimed they're very good environmentally because they reduce hotel construction. And they also have put out studies that argue the average Airbnb traveler has a much lower footprint than a traveler who stays in a hotel, because hotels tend to be more high energy users. And I think they've exaggerated that difference, but that's probably the case. But what's not as well studied yet is what we might call induced travel as a result of Airbnb, because they're making travel much cheaper. Particularly these leisure travelers have a strong, high sensitivity to cost. And my belief is that Airbnb has induced a reasonable amount of travel. And if it's air travel, the impact is so much larger than hotel construction and energy use. It just dwarfs that impact. And it's interesting because most of the people who participate in the quote unquote sharing economy believe strongly that it has environmental benefits. It sort of makes sense to them, but they're thinking just about those direct impacts and not the, what we call the rebound effects or these price effects, because ultimately all of the commercialized versions of the commercialized initiatives in the sharing economy offer, for any given quality, they're offering lower price services. That's the market that they're in. So when something is cheaper, people buy more of it.
But this seems to say to me as such that the sharing economy, that the only bits that have really done well are the ones where the clear driver is financial gain, either savings for the people using the space or being able to travel, and obviously income for the people who give space out. Does that say, that actually true sharing, as we imagine, where you just share things for free, we're not very good at it, or at least the new technologies of the online have not really made any difference to our ability to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe a little stronger than I would go, but I think generally right. Even where you're talking about, sharing that has some financial dimension to it, I don't agree with the idea that says sharing has to be non-monetary. But I mean, I think there are lots of different ways to use the word sharing. Let's just say that.
There is an element of pure sharing that, share nicely as a child, you're told.
Yeah.
Which is fundamentally what we're brought up to do, and it is non-monetary.
And so those are harder. Those have been harder to scale, precisely for, I think, the reasons that you say. But it's also that people don't have their motives for doing that are not so strong. Whereas with the Airbnb, you have that strong motive. But even where you're talking about small rental costs, let's say a neighborhood platform that charges a relatively low fee for people to do the renting of durable goods, of tools or specialized equipment and so on and so forth, so there's a sharing aspect because people are not trying to get, what the full market would bear. So it's like a mix. You could think of it as a mixed motive kind of thing. They really haven't worked out. I mean, one thing I was reading recently, it was about the drill, a power drill for doing repairs and construction. It has been sort of the canonical item in the marketing of these platforms. Like, you don't need a drill because you only use it a couple of times a year. What you really need is the way to get a hole in your wall. So
Yeah.
why do you have to buy a drill? But it turns out that a drill costs $30 or, 30 pounds or something. And people would just rather buy the drill than go through the hassle of finding one in the neighborhood and paying them a bit of money. It's so, unless you're talking about really expensive items that people don't use all that much, often specialized items, there's not like a really strong economic need here. And some of those specialized items already have commercial alternatives for renting them.
Yes, yes.
But there are some interesting sharing platforms in global context. There's one for tractors in India. That's a interesting one. But they're not all peer-to-peer. Some of them are. But there again, you have that, back to your earlier point, in the rural areas in the US, for example, you had a lot of informal sharing arrangements with things like tractors. So this is probably why why you don't see big scaling up in some of these kinds of things. Longer term, the technology is really useful. And as people get, more habituated to it and so forth, we may see the development of some of these markets. It may just be a little early in some of these cases.
But I suppose the vision, I would imagine, around the sharing economy is that you put more of the sort of relationship and building relationships, the social connectivity into economic relationships, if you like, through a sharing economy. And from what you're saying, that really hasn't ended up being a driver or really taken off. Is that right? Or?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we found that in Airbnb, that's a very important motive for people, and they do find that they make connections, and sometimes they even make friends, people they see again in the future, and so forth. So for the hosts, the sociability is quite important, also for guests. But that's for the portion of the market which has been, now it's a slight minority at our lab, maybe even a little bit less now, but with our data set, just under half, somewhere in the 40%, are the actual shared accommodations where the host is present. And it's a mix. We have hosts who have minimal contact with the people they're the guests, but then we have other hosts who are quite sociable. They take meals together. They might, go to a bar together and so forth. And they really value the social interaction. And many of those tend to be where the guests are from other countries.
Yeah.
That's a little bit more in some of the certain cities, you'll see it. So most of our research is in Boston. So we get a lot of European travelers, and the hosts really like that. Now, one thing about it is it's very socially homogeneous. So they tend to be people of similar class, maybe similar age, whereas it's not necessarily leading people to meet people who are socioeconomically different from them. They tend to be mostly nationally different.
So people with spare bedrooms are middle class or upper middle class or whatever, and people who can travel to share those houses are also in the same class.
Right, and they also screen for that. So we find that some of our hosts, they do Google searches on the guests, and they want to, do they have college degrees? Do they own homes? They won't let just anybody into their house. But I do think that Airbnb has facilitated at least a sort of superficial level of social connectivity in ways that these other initiatives, really don't do, because there's not much opportunity for interaction. Like some of the Airbnb for cars, for example, they have remote technology that allows you to get access to the car without ever meeting the owner, for example.
But presumably blah, blah cars might also create some sort of relationships as well, which is good.
Yeah.
So I think that is a good note to end on, but that's been really interesting. And I think, the sharing economy is a sort of emerging phenomena, and it's very interesting to get a perspective on where it's going. So thank you very much, Juliet, for talking to us today.
My pleasure. It's been a delight.